Now, this lecture aims to evaluate the modern world's dismissal and its criticism of the medieval world as a period of darkness, of barbarity, of superstition. Is this a fair evaluation of a 1,000-year period that, despite their hardships, the plagues, the famines, and the like, produced the world that now looks down upon the civilization that helped to create it? The tale of brave Ulysses and the moral Dante draws from the tale may provide us with the answer why the modern world looks down upon the Middle Ages. Ulysses, for all his strength and cunning, dared to push beyond the boundaries God had set for mankind, and for this act of hubris, Ulysses was destroyed. And modern man largely hates the idea of limits, that there are certain boundaries beyond which man should not sail, feats he dare not attempt, rules he should not break. And whereas Dante condemns Ulysses for pushing beyond such boundaries, later writers, from the Romantics to the moderns, celebrate Ulysses for this very character trait, his desire to experience everything which life under the sun has to offer, and push beyond every boundary that would dare constrain man. In contrast, the medieval world accepted, and in some ways even celebrated, the reality that man was not in control of his fate. The hardships that people faced in the medieval world were a daily reminder of their own lack of control over their lives. And this prompted the peoples of medieval Europe to turn to Christianity and cling tightly to their local church as a means of giving meaning to their suffering, and indeed as a means of escaping from it. So Thomas Aquinas refused to finish the Summa after he received the vision he believed came from God, since his own works paled in comparison to what he had seen. And Dante ends the Inferno looking up at the stars and being reminded of God's presence and control over the world, even in the midst of so much suffering. But this is not a characteristic of the modern world, a world that largely begins in a movement called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment and its major thinkers, called the Philosophes, individuals like Voltaire and Denis Diderot, condemned the church in particular and organized religion in general for being superstitious and unyielding in light of the suffering they saw in the world. The Philosophes wanted to cast off the restraints imposed upon them by tradition and remake the world in their own image, according to the dictates of their own reason. To aid them in this endeavor, the Philosophes would pass over the Middle Ages with its superstition and bring back the glories of the classical past, unmediated through the influence of Christianity by the scholastics or the clergy, to a time when man was in control, or at least man wielded far more control than the Middle Ages would ever reserve for man. Looking back into the classical world, the Philosophes could agree heartily with Greek sages like Protagoras when he said, "Man is the measure of all things." Or quote from Roman poets like Lucretius, who stated, "Tantum religio potuit sudere malorum," to such heights of evil are men driven by religion. It is no wonder then that a world which places man at the very center looks down on the medieval world that reserves that place for God and the church. Nor is it any coincidence that during the Enlightenment you have the rise of the new sciences, new pursuits that would not only push man beyond the boundaries in which medieval man was once confined, like Ulysses dared to sail beyond the pillars of Hercules, but also give modern man far more control over the new world he was making. Commercial pursuits, even systematizing the laws by which man may enjoy and prolong his prosperity in the new field of economics, and the experimental sciences that promised and indeed delivered upon that promise to make man a master over nature. All cultivated by a new confidence in the powers of human reason and of the ability, not necessarily the reality, but the ability, even the right of man to direct his fate. If medieval man turned to God because his world was horrible, perhaps modern man turned away from God because he is in the process of making his world so much better than God left it. And if there's still more work to be done, then more control should be given to man, or at least to certain men, so they can finish what the philosophers started. But this leaves the classical educator with a dilemma. Dare we risk being labeled obscurantists, perhaps criticized as teachers who want to drag their students back into the Middle Ages? The modern world has progressed so far beyond the confines of serfdom that surely we do not mean to bring it back. And no, of course not. The modern world is certainly a far more comfortable place to live, and I am not by any means advocating going back to the heyday of feudalism. I am saying that modern man needs limits as much as any man in history has ever needed them. Think of those events in history when man has thrown off the boundaries that once restrained his conduct, from the French Revolution at the end of the Enlightenment to the untold millions of people who died under Soviet communism in the 20th century. At these times, the times when man has thrown off those boundaries, horrific bloodshed on an hitherto unprecedented scale ensued, and surely no one wants that either. Man needs those boundaries if he is to flourish, because beyond such boundaries lurks an abyss that power-hungry men often fill with their designs. In contrast, a classical education aims to preserve the ideas and the ideals which we have received from the ancient Greeks, the Romans, and especially the Middle Ages, because the Middle Ages helps us make sense of the classical past and consider what ideas we ought to preserve from the classical world and which we ought to discard for the world we live in today. In short, the Middle Ages helps us sift the wheat from the chaff of the ancient world and draw the line between what man can do and what man shouldn't do, and gives to us a host of ideas that help us draw this line to everyone's benefit. Chief among these ideas is the belief that man is a unique creation, and as such, all human beings possess an inherent dignity which cannot be taken away or devalued, an idea first derived from the Bible that is uniquely rooted in the Western tradition and permeates throughout the whole of the Middle Ages until it became one of the tenets, the central tenets of classical liberalism. Man indeed is capable of great things, but even so, the human condition is fragile and by no means strong enough to support a meaningful life all by itself. Human beings need something more, and so as classical educators, we turn to the great writers of the past to help make sense of the chaotic world in which we live in the present and give us the intellectual tools by which we can solve the dilemmas that come against us. Indeed, the classical educator has a very powerful weapon, a canon. Not a real literal canon, but the great books of the Western canon. These great books stretch back for thousands of years, and we use them to shape and adorn the conscience of our students. We offer the collective literary wealth of the Western tradition, set it before our students like the table at a great banquet, and invite them to enjoy these works at their heart's content. That is the best work of which we, as classical educators, are capable, because the Western tradition is not merely a collection of abstract ideas. Instead, it is itself a record of humanity's attempt to find meaning in the world around us. And the Western tradition, from the Greeks to the scholastics and into the modern world, agrees that man is capable of much, but should he attempt too much, he may amount to nothing at all. So as Isaac Newton said that great men stand on the shoulders of giants, so classical education aims to preserve the giants of the Western canon from the ancient, the medieval, and indeed the modern world, so that our students may stand upon their shoulders and survey with confidence the world in which they live. We take our students through the great books, so our students have the confidence to take on the whole world, albeit without taking on the hubris that would make them wager far more than they ever intended to give for it.